Sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't when someone leaves, it's when they stay, but constantly dismiss everything you feel like it's nothing worth holding on to. Welcome to Broken Truth, where love meets lies, and every story reveals the pain behind the smile. When someone doesn't respect your feelings, it's not just about lack of empathy, it's often rooted in emotional immaturity and control. They betray not by cheating, but by invalidating you repeatedly, making you feel like your pain is an inconvenience, your needs are a burden. People like this often crave dominance in the relationship. They want love without accountability, closeness without vulnerability, so they gaslight, avoid real conversations, and slowly wear you down until you begin to question if your emotions are even valid. Betrayal here is quiet, a repeated refusal to honor what matters to you. You used to think that love looked like presence, that if someone stayed, if they didn't leave, it meant they cared. That silence wasn't silence, it was comfort. That the sigh they gave when you spoke was just tiredness, not indifference. That love, you learned far too slowly, is not in the body that stays, but the soul that listens. It began quietly, as it always does. A skipped reply, a conversation cut short with, "Don't make it a big deal," a look that said again. When you brought up the weight in your chest, you started measuring your words, calculating how much feeling would be too much. You edited your pain, softened your tone, laughed at your own sadness so they wouldn't have to. You thought compromise was love. You thought swallowing your truth made you strong. But every time you bit your tongue, a little part of you bled. You remember one night, not dramatic, not loud, you were sitting by the window, talking about how your day had felt heavy for no reason. And they said, without looking up, "You overthink everything?" 4 words, casual, careless, cruel. You nodded like a good partner. You nodded like someone used to being dismissed. But something cracked. Not loud enough to break anything, just enough for light to enter. That's how it happened. Not all at once, not in a fight, not in a betrayal wrapped in another's arms, but in the unbearable quiet of being emotionally erased while physically embraced. You lay beside someone who called you love, and yet you felt lonelier than you ever had alone. They didn't notice when your silences got longer, when your laughter turned into polite noise, when your eyes stayed dry because crying felt like a waste. They didn't ask why you stopped reaching for their hand, or why your "I love you" sounded like a question, because to them, your feelings were always extra, always a mess they didn't want to clean. You began to journal again, a habit from before you met them. You wrote things you could never say aloud. Why do I feel invisible in front of someone who sees me every day? How much of myself do I have to erase to be lovable? The pages became your witness, your secret therapist. The version of you that remembered softness didn't mean weakness. One morning, over coffee, you said, "Sometimes I feel like you don't hear me." You meant it tenderly, you meant it like someone giving a chance. They sighed, rolled their eyes, said, "You're too emotional." And there it was. The betrayal in full bloom, not a slap, not a scream, just that simple sentence dropped. Like a blade, you remember sitting still, letting it hang in the air. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't explain. You just nodded again. But this time, not out of surrender. This time, it was quiet understanding. You finally saw it. They weren't going to change, and you weren't too emotional. You were human, and you deserved to be heard. That evening, you went to the park alone, sat on the bench where you both once talked for hours. You stared at the trees, the leaves turning brown at the edges. That's how your love looked now, not dead, but dying slowly, not because of distance, but because it was never watered. You stopped trying after that, not out of spite, not out of anger, but because some part of you had started to mourn. You stopped shrinking, you stopped laughing at things that hurt. You let your tears fall in. The shower, you began to feel again, even if it was grief. They noticed your stillness finally, not because they cared, but because it was inconvenient. You weren't playing your part anymore. You weren't the soft landing they took for. Granted, one night they said, "Why are you acting weird lately?" And you said, gently, honestly, "Because I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt." There was no argument, just silence. The same kind they had always used as a weapon, but this time you were no longer afraid of it. This time, silence meant peace. You began to sleep on the other side of the bed. Not out of punishment, just because it felt right. You texted friends again. You smiled at strangers. You bought yourself flowers and didn't wait for them to ask why. You were returning to yourself, not with a bang, but with small, steady steps. You didn't leave all at once. You stayed longer than you should have, hoping maybe just once they would say, "I hear you." But that day never came, and so eventually you packed quietly. No big fights, no final breakdowns, just folded clothes and whispered goodbyes in your head. They didn't ask you to stay. Maybe they thought you wouldn't go. Maybe they never imagined someone so emotional could also be so strong, but you were, and you did. The first night alone felt strange, the silence so familiar. Now wrapped around you differently. It wasn't cold anymore. It was sacred. It was yours. You looked at yourself in the mirror, tired but honest, and you said aloud, "I'm not difficult. I'm just not disposable." It took months to unlearn the belief that you needed to be less to be loved, but each day you chose yourself a little more. You cried without apology. You wrote without censorship. You stopped explaining your heart like it was a flaw. You realized betrayal doesn't always come with broken vows. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone who sees your vulnerability as a nuisance, someone who stays but never shows up, and you finally stopped waiting for them to change. You stopped trying to fix what wasn't yours to carry. You stopped mistaking neglect for strength, because love, real love, doesn't ask you to dim your light to make someone else comfortable. It listens, it holds space. It says, "I see you. All of you, and you're safe here, and you were always worth that." They sat in the quiet that used to scare them, and this time it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like space, like breath, like finally hearing themselves think without needing to shrink their truth for someone else's comfort. The first few days were strange. They were used to second-guessing everything. Did I say too much? Was I too emotional? Should I have just let it go? But now, with no one there to silence them, the questions stopped coming. The silence became softer, less like a void, more like a room with open windows. They didn't rush to fill the emptiness. They let the stillness stretch, not as punishment, but as practice. A practice in being, in not needing to fix, explain, justify, or prove. They weren't trying to be understood anymore. They were trying to understand themselves. They began noticing what made them feel safe. A cup of tea with both hands wrapped around it, music that didn't try too hard, friends who asked, "How are you really?" and waited for the answer. These moments became anchors, proof that not all connection was conditional. They started small, setting boundaries in places they never had, saying no without offering a reason, letting a message sit without replying just because they didn't have the energy, not apologizing for needing rest. At first, it felt awkward, heavy, but with each choice, their spine straightened, their voice got clearer. They began to say things like, "I'm not okay with that. That hurt, and I need to talk about it. I deserve to feel safe in how I express myself." The words didn't come perfectly. Sometimes they trembled. Sometimes they over-explained, then caught themselves mid-sentence and said, "Actually, I don't need to justify this." And that was growth, the gentle kind, the kind that builds strength without armor. They also stopped labeling themselves as too much. They realized they weren't dramatic. They were deep feeling. They weren't needy. They were honest about their needs. And anyone who made them feel ashamed for that was simply the wrong audience. They looked back now, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They saw how they were trained to question their feelings instead of honoring them, how they were made to believe that love meant tolerance, not tenderness, but now they knew better love. The real kind doesn't fear emotion, it welcomes. They created rituals to come back home to themselves, morning walks without music, notes on their bathroom mirror that said, "You don't have to earn being heard," therapy sessions where they cried without flinching, journals filled with letters they never sent because healing didn't need an audience. One day, they met someone new, a friend, a stranger, maybe more. It didn't matter. What mattered was how it felt. There was no fear of being too much, no anxiety before speaking, just presence. They laughed without shrinking. They shared without rehearsing, and when they said, "That made me feel small," the other person replied, "Tell me more." It was then they realized their healing wasn't about finding someone new. It was about becoming someone who knew their voice mattered, who wouldn't settle for emotional crumbs, who could walk away the moment they felt unseen, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. They stopped chasing closure from those who never valued them. They stopped explaining their feelings like they were a courtroom case. Instead, they let their emotions exist without judgment, without needing permission, and in that peace, they found power, not the loud kind. Not the kind that demands to be noticed, but the quiet kind that stands tall in the softest of ways, that says, "I know myself now. I trust what I feel. I will never again stay where my heart is silenced," because they weren't. Too sensitive, they were simply unheard by someone who never knew how to listen, and now they listen to themselves every day with tenderness, and they protect that voice like it's sacred, because it is. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible next to someone who said they loved you, know that your emotions are not a burden. This is broken truth. Subscribe for more stories that say what your heart has always known.